We were listening to Master's voice earlier during the meditation. He made reference, we were listening to an excerpt from a talk on his birthday. And Master was talking about how touched he was by the love that people were offering to him. And he mentioned, my master was there, he said, meaning Sri Yukteswar, and how Master was offering all the love that was being given to him back to Sri Yukteswar, because it was because of Sri Yukteswar that Yogananda, Master, felt he had been so able to draw people to God. We don't have that many references, but there are some. And Swami talked about how often Master would reference everything back to Sri Yukteswar, or he would reference it back to Babaji. We have the story in the autobiography of a yogi told by Richard Wright, who was traveling with Master when Master went to India in 1935, and how eager Master was to get to Sri Yukteswar's ashram. And in fact, the entire reason that Master went back to India is because his guru called him. Yogananda felt in America Sri Yukteswar calling him from India, so Rajarsi gave him all the money he needed and he went on that trip. And it was to get to his guru's ashram. And then Richard Wright describes the scene that you can only imagine, because, of course, in all of the life that all of the disciples had had with Yogananda, he was always the source of everything, and everyone, stood at the very edge of his consciousness and couldn't stand with him, except for Rajarsi. So now, all of a sudden, Master himself is the disciple. He's falling at the feet of his guru. Now, Master was God realized, and had been God realized for many, many incarnations. The whole guru-disciple, on one level, was just a divine play. It wasn't really required on a certain level, but the reverence never ceased. At the end of Master's life, Swami tells the story about a devoted disciple who lived on a small pension, and he gathered walnuts from the roadside that had fallen from the trees, and sold the walnuts, and bought yarn, and then with needlepoint he made a picture of Sri Yukteswar and presented it to Master with great devotion. And Master took that picture of Sri Yukteswar and hung it in the hallway right outside his room. And Master describes how Swamiji describes how every time Master passed it, he would bow to it in reverence. We have the story of Jesus, who, according to the tradition that Yogananda tells us, they were Elisha and Elijah in the past life, and then John the Baptist was Elijah in a past life, and he was still Jesus' guru, even though Jesus had received a double portion of Elijah's consciousness at the end of the Old Testament, and in the moment was a greater light than John the Baptist. But still, Jesus came and accepted baptism from John. And when John said, I'm not worthy, Jesus said, it's in the fitness of things that this should happen. So we're working with something here that doesn't fit into our little boxes of who's who and what's what and where the power is and how we offer things. We're dealing with something on a totally different plane. I was thinking about Swamiji, as I often do, of course. And the extraordinary childlike humility that he held effortlessly to the end of his life, even when so much was swirling around him, especially in India, where they're more attuned to these things and more expressive of them. Literally, they had to make a cordon of devotees holding hands so that Swami could get in and out of a lecture hall, because otherwise people were just throwing themselves at his feet and he couldn't walk. He couldn't get in or out. And Swami was just completely untouched by it. In fact, he made the interesting comment once. He said, "I'm just the same old fellow," he said. "But as the years pass, I feel the myth swirling around me more and more." One of the last things he said at one of his last programs at Ananda Village, after he just got up and had finished this big talk to some hundreds of people and he was starting back, I think he was still on the microphone, he said, "Well, time to put this nut back in its shell." Just like that, he put it, just very casually. Now, on one hand, that could be an affectation. But with Swamiji, he just never saw himself in any other light except with humility. But I was understanding why. Because he never really saw what was going on around him. All he saw was his discipleship to Master. And toward the end of his life, especially, for those of you who were here, it's all he would talk about. He told us over and over again about meeting Master. And each time it was like we'd never heard the story he had to tell us. It was the most important news he had to give us. It was how he read the autobiography, how he went, what Master said. But again, it wasn't an affectation. It was the only thing that he was ever looking at. And we were looking at him writing books and changing our lives and traveling around the world and speaking many languages and founding this and starting communities. He never saw any of that in and of itself. He just saw himself in relationship to Master and the promise that he had given to Master to be his disciple, to obey him and to serve his work. And even greater, the commission he'd received to do a great work. But the humility was effortless because Swamiji was always seeing himself in relation to infinity. And it's kind of hard to feel important in relation to infinity. Every little thing that we're doing, how do you measure it? In what Shanti read, Master just uses the simple, it was from the essence of self-realization. And Master uses the simple thing, if you take something very small and hold it out in front of you, it looks small. But if you pull it up close, it looks very large. Well, if you take something very large and pull it up close, it looks infinite. And Swamiji never took his consciousness away from Master. If the Guru is pleased, that's all that matters. Nobody else's pleasure or disapproval matters. The only thing that matters is if the Guru is pleased. And if I'm living in his light, then what have I to fear anywhere? And all of us as disciples, Swamiji defined his entire purpose in incarnating, was to show us what it means to be a disciple. And what it means to be a disciple is to define yourself by nothing else. There's one light, and that light is the beacon. Wherever I'm going, whatever I'm doing. I'm sure all of you have had experiences that I've had when you do something that you think is okay, but then there's this sort of pulsing dissonance. Swamiji once talked about when he was in India, and someone told him that there were many more steps to the Kriya practice than Swami had ever learned. And there was an opportunity for him to learn from a disciple of Lahiri Mahashaya more of the Kriya. And Swami thought, well, Master died when I was such a young disciple. If I'd been there longer, I could have learned from him. And after all, this is a disciple of our line, our Lahiri Kriya. But as it turned out, in order for him to receive those techniques, he also had to take initiation. It's a very interesting story because Swami was such a advanced soul, but he said, well, he decided that he would do it. He said from the moment he did that, a certain dissonance set into his consciousness. And for 6 months he practiced what he'd learned, but the more time passed, the more this dissonance was just growing like this. And he finally realized, everything I need comes from Master. I can't go anywhere else, no matter what my reason tells me. And he said in his heart he just simply repudiated that whole experience. And immediately, Master was with him as he had always been. I mean, there's a very, very fine vibration that if we're serious about this, we have to always be looking for. It's not something to feel anxious about or paranoid about it at all. It's just, the challenge is to just make it a habit, to just refer everything back to the Guru's teachings and the vibration of his consciousness, or the power of God, the power of the light, if your commitment is less specific. But for those of you who are disciples of this path, use what you've been given. Don't squander it. Swamiji was once writing a very complicated letter to one of his Guru Bhais in the endless strife that characterized his life with his fellow disciples. And he wrote, I imagine myself, he said, when this life is over, standing in front of Master again. And Master saying to me, Swami writes, do you love me? And Swami says, and I will answer, you are all that I have ever loved. Now, when you think about how many people were loved by Swamiji, how many people's lives were changed by the power of his love, but in his own heart, all he was ever loving was his Guru. Now don't misunderstand that. It wasn't that he didn't see us, or care about us, or recognize our individuality, but he himself said, very early on when he was a young man, learning to share his Guru's teachings, even when he would stand in front of an audience, he said, he would feel that within everyone, Master was present. And someone said to him, how can you be lecturing to your own Guru? But that wasn't what Swami was feeling. What he was feeling was that the awakening power, the potentially awakening power of Spirit was everywhere. And that the personification of that was Master. And Swamiji, as he told us, read Autobiography of a Yogi, completely abandoned everything he had been before, came to where Master was as quickly as he could, all across the whole country, saw him for the first time, and said, I want to be your disciple. You are all that I have ever loved. And when we begin to think like that, actually, it all gets very simple. How much am I loving? There's that wonderful story of Dr. Ritchie, who was a man who had a death experience in return. And he was a devout Christian, and so he went into the presence of Jesus. And he was only in his early 20s, but his life review was not pretty because he had been a very selfish and self-centered man. And in the presence of the Savior, as Dr. Ritchie called him, all Jesus asked him was the simplest question: how much have you loved? And Dr. Ritchie, with great embarrassment, realized the answer was not very much. In fact, almost none at all. The only thing he had loved was himself, always looking for his own advantage, never thinking of others. But all that God asked him, all that Jesus asked him, how much have you loved? And so, fortunately, he was returned to his body and devoted himself after that to loving as much as he could. What gives us the power to do that? Because we look around and there's a lot in this world that's intensely unlovable. Even people that we live very closely with, sometimes we find them very difficult to love. People are just who they are. There's evil people on this planet. There's idiotic, demonic people on this planet. We can't just sort of pretend. But behind it all, animating all of it, there's only one reality. And there's only one relevant truth. And that relevant truth is that infinite one has taken human form for one purpose, which is to bring us to that same state of realization. And that infinite one, in the form of the Guru, known or unknown to us, is constantly watching and constantly pulling, just pulling us, whispering from eternity, as Master called it, just constantly pulling on us. Are we loving him? Are we loving that truth? Or are we allowing ourselves to be lost everywhere? In everything we do, whether we're walking alone down the street, whether we're out in nature, whether we're playing a game, whether we're singing, whether we're meditating, he's always the same with us. And he's always pulsing. Where is your consciousness? How much are you loving? Do you love me? What joy won't it be, will it be, to be able to say with Swamiji, when it's all over, when this incarnation ends, and we're standing with the form of God that comes to us, how much have you loved? Have you loved me? You are all that I have ever loved. Let that be our resolution. There's no other birthday present we can give to a God-realized Master. He has everything but our commitment to become like him. Make that commitment and keep it with everything you have.